So the height of desegregation efforts in our country coincided with the period of the most dramatic narrowing of the black-white achievement gap ever recorded. And scholars don't attribute this just to desegregation. There were countless initiatives enacted in the 60s and 70s that bore fruit for quite a few years. But it's important to note that those gains have all been lost since the 80s and 90s. So new evidence from Stanford economist Sean Reardon shows that the income achievement gap is now nearly twice what the black-white achievement gap was. So 50 years ago, that was reversed. So I didn't say that right. The income achievement gap is now nearly twice as large as the black-white achievement gap. So 50 years ago, that was the reverse. The black-white achievement gap was larger than the SES gap. So this means that while racial segregation is important, poverty really matters. So any effort to improve school quality in Charlotte, we really need to be focusing on poverty. And the good news is that our community's demographics make that possible. It's the good news. There's lots of good news in here. Don't worry. I know it's been doom and gloom so far, but it gets better. So, and I want to be clear in all my presentations, I don't think that we have the appetite in our community, nor do I think the data suggests that or supports a return to a county-wide desegregation plan like what we had under Swan. There are serious challenges inherent in desegregated schooling. Research is clear that desegregation is not a silver bullet, but it appears to work better than anything else we've tried, and the data supports that. So in many ways, for our communities, desegregation was a rejected success. Our dramatic imbalance of race and socioeconomic status is new, and our children are increasingly isolated. And this matters because school effect trumps family effect. So the racial and poverty composition of the school affects student outcomes net of student and family influences. So translation, it matters who you're in a school building with. And for white children, this matters because America's browning, and white students can only learn cultural competencies by learning and working alongside people who are not white. And our workplaces are not white. Nationally, white students are the most racially isolated. And our imbalance is new in our community. It's really happened in the last 15 years. And each dot here represents a school that is 80% or more for reduced lunch and 80% or more students of color. When I was going through school, my schools were typically 50-ish% white, 40-ish% black. There was a very small Latino and Asian population in Charlotte in the 80s and even up until the early 90s. But now we are living in what some have called a technicolor period. So there are 175 languages spoken by CMS students in their homes. The proportion of CMS students who are white is half what it was when I was in school, which, wasn't that long ago. So these changes aren't because of white flight, and that's really important. Or these changes are not from private school enrollment. This shift is because of shifting birth rates and people moving here. Our community has changed, not just our schools. Which isn't surprising given the increase in poverty rates our community has seen in the last 15 years. So such demographics make some kind of desegregation or whatever you want to call it. It makes it challenging, but it doesn't make it impossible. So we have the numbers in our community and therefore the opportunity to reduce and possibly to even eliminate hyper-segregated schools of poverty. Rates of imbalance are helpful in making comparisons because such rates take into effect a district's population. So of the 10 largest districts in North Carolina, we are now the most imbalanced by race and the most imbalanced by SES. This map shows SES. But our district was not always this way, as we've heard. This change is particularly stark when we compare it to Wake County, where Charlotte and Mecklenburg adopted a choice-based assignment plan in the 90s. Wake County has taken a different path and uses a voluntary student assignment plan to prevent isolation. Wake County has never been under a mandatory desegregation plan. Everything they've done has been voluntary. So there's a great book titled Why There Are No Bad Schools in Raleigh. That's the title. And this is the thesis of the book, and he does a pretty good job proving it, is that it's because they have no isolated schools of poverty and no racially isolated schools in their entire district. So in contrast, our isolation worsens each year. Though we were once considered a national model, as we've heard, we are now close to reaching levels of segregation that we saw prior to Swan. Not quite there, but we're getting there. And our level of imbalance does not have to stay high. As my co-editor Steve Smith says, segregation is not like the weather. It is not an uncontrollable force. The choices of yesterday and the choices of today, they shape the choices of tomorrow. So a referendum that passed in 1959 allows us to work together as a district to avoid isolation. We were 4 districts prior to that referendum. And then we became 1. And because of that decision, we have the numbers to have diverse schools. We just choose not to for a variety of reasons. And many communities, and this is a hopeful point. If it's not real clear, I should have put like rainbows and starbursts somewhere. But the hopeful point here is that many communities don't even have this option. So St. Louis County, for example, they have the same number of children, similar kind of county going on, but they have 20-some districts in that region, in their county, whereas we have 1. So we have a lot of opportunities. When Robert Putnam was here a few months back, he's the author of a book called Our Kids. Hopefully you've seen that deep, go through the slides. It's a great book. I would suggest it to everyone. But he talked extensively about segregation in our community. And he pointed out that we had some options, right? We could move money, we could move children, which is what we did in the past, or we could move parents. So we've been moving money since the court came, or in about the past 8 or 9 years. We've had weighted student funding in Charlotte, where we fund high poverty students at a ratio of 1.3 versus a student who's not high poverty or doesn't qualify for free reduced lunch is funded as 1 child. So we've been moving money. So, and while necessary, Lord knows what our scores would look like if we hadn't been moving money, I guess is the translation of that. So while necessary, moving money in our district has proved to be insufficient. Our outcomes suggest that we should look at other options. And options do not mean forced busing, just to be clear. And you might have noticed that this is the first time I've used busing in this presentation. And that's because this conversation, it's not about busing. We bus to segregate, as we've talked about tonight. We bus to desegregate. And we bus more now than we did at the height of desegregation in the 80s. These data are from the Department of Public Instruction. This is the number of miles driven by school buses divided by the average daily membership annually. So this conversation isn't around cost savings associated with not busing because there aren't any. We bus now for choice. So some families in our community have an array of schooling choices. Around 1 in 4 schools in CMS are partial or full magnets. And remember that because we're going to come back to that in the presentation. Our magnet schools are the highest performing and most diverse schools in CMS. In 2014-2015, more than 30,000 students were served by private schools and charter schools in Mecklenburg County. In 2011, the General Assembly eliminated the 100 school maximum for charter schools in North Carolina. And since that time, Mecklenburg County has seen the fastest expansion in the state of charter schools. We had 13 charter schools in 2012. This year we have 25. And these choices are changing over time. So the market share for CMS has stayed fairly steady. Fewer families are choosing private schools, but more families are choosing charter schools. Charter school enrollment has increased by 585% in the past 15 years. And it's important to note that charter schools are some of the most segregated schools in the state. So now in our community, we have those who are the children of segregation. We have the children of segregation, or desegregation, like myself. And now, in our community, we have the children of choice. And I use this word with a great deal of irony, because the children who are in the hyper-segregated schools, they don't have choice. Where I spent the majority of my career as an educator, my children don't have choice. So while there are benefits to diverse schools. Perhaps the greatest reason to advocate for diverse schools is to avoid the harm that occurs with isolation.